Hey everyone, Noah Zerby here. In this video, we're going to look at Graham Allison's classic text, The Essence of Decision, as we apply the three models outlined in Allison's work to understand the Cuban Missile Crisis. You should remember from our previous discussions that on October 15th, 1962, a U-2 reconnaissance flight over Cuba photographed Soviet construction of launch sites and missile deployments to the island. The missiles were quickly identified as SS-4 Sandal and SS-5 Skeen intermediate-range nuclear missiles, capable of striking targets across the eastern United States with little to no warning. President Kennedy was informed of the deployment early the next morning, and the Cuban Missile Crisis began. Now, in this video, we're not going to go through all of the events or the timelines of the crisis itself. That's been accomplished in other videos. Instead, we're going to walk through Graham Allison's three models of decision-making outlined in his book, The Essence of Decision. Allison wrote The Essence of Decision largely as a critique of the ex post facto efforts by analysts to apply rational expectations to decision-making. Instead, Allison thought to understand how decisions were made on the ground, particularly in times of crisis. To guide this analysis, Allison poses three questions, which he then answers using the three different models. First, he asks, why did the Soviet Union decide to place nuclear missiles in Cuba? Second, he asks why the United States responded to the Soviet decision the way they did. That is, why did the United States impose a naval blockade or quarantine on Cuba? And finally, he asks why the Soviet Union withdrew its missiles from Cuba. Allison begins his analysis with the rational actor model. As we've previously considered, the rational actor model assumes that governments are unitary actors pursuing goals defined as the national interest and engaging in a rational cost-benefit analysis to select the best alternative to reach those goals. Under this model, Allison explains the Cuban Missile Crisis like this. In the early 1960s, the Soviet Union suffered from a severe missile gap. The Soviet Union had just a handful of intercontinental ballistic missiles capable of striking the United States, perhaps about 30 when the Cuban Missile Crisis began. They had many more and many more accurate intermediate-range missiles, but no way to deliver them to targets in the United States. The United States, by contrast, had 200 ICBMs, dozens of submarine-launched missiles, and hundreds of intermediate-range missiles stationed in Western Europe and Turkey, all capable of striking targets inside the Soviet Union. From the Soviet perspective, it was critical to create a credible deterrence to the threat of an American nuclear strike, and deploying missiles to Cuba could help achieve that goal. Further, based on the failure of the US-sponsored Bay of Pigs invasion, the Soviet leadership believed that the US would be unlikely to respond forcefully to the Soviet move, and that once operational, the missiles themselves would serve as a deterrent to future invasion attempts. Deploying the missiles secretly and quickly was thus perceived as the best path forward. Once the Americans learned of the Soviet deployment, Kennedy and his advisors met to consider the options available to the U.S., which were numerous. The U.S. could do nothing and ignore the Soviet deployment. The USSR, after all, already had missiles capable of reaching the United States, and what difference would it make if the missiles were launched from the continental USSR or from the island of Cuba? The U.S. could attempt to use diplomacy to pressure the Soviet Union into removing the missiles from Cuba. It could engage in covert negotiations, attempting to split the Castro regime away from the Soviet Union. The U.S. could launch a ground invasion of Cuba in an effort to capture the missile sites and overthrow the Castro regime. It could launch airstrikes to destroy the missiles, or it could impose a blockade and prevent any additional missiles from arriving in Cuba. In the end, Kennedy and his advisors settled on the final option, a blockade of Cuba, because it avoided escalation of the crisis while forcing the Soviets to make the next move. According to the rational actor model, in the face of the blockade and the threat of mutually assured destruction in a nuclear war, the Soviet Union had no choice but to give in to the demands of the United States and remove their missiles from Cuba. The US won, and the crisis was averted. But the story told from the rational actor model ignores some important elements of the story. Why, for example, did the Soviets not attempt to hide their construction of the nuclear missile sites in Cuba while they were being built? The entire Soviet operation had been planned out at the highest levels and with the utmost secrecy. After all, from the Soviet perspective, the value of the missiles in Cuba would only be realized once those missiles were operational. Deterrence only works when the threat of a response is credible. This helps to partially explain why developing nuclear weapons programs are so risky, but once developed, countries with nuclear weapons are generally more safe from foreign intervention. The Soviet deployment of missiles to Cuba had taken place under the code name Operation Anadyr, named for a river in the far northeastern corner of Siberia, and suggesting an operation somewhere in the Soviet Arctic. Over a period of several months, more than 40,000 Soviet soldiers and technicians were covertly ferried to Cuba, hidden in cargo ships or disguised as tourists arriving on cruise ships. Military equipment and construction material, as well as the nuclear missiles themselves, were brought to Cuba via shipments disguised as agricultural equipment and food. But once deployed to Cuba, the subterfuge ended. The missiles were left out in the open, and the construction sites were made with no real effort to hide the missiles, the soldiers, really any element of the operation. Why? The answer is standard operating procedure. According to the organizational process model, decisions are often not the result of specific cost-benefit analysis of all of the various options in pursuit of a predefined goal, but instead are often the result of standard operating procedure and institutional inertia. When faced with a crisis, decision makers often break down the bigger question into specific pieces based on already established organizational lines. In the United States, this means that diplomatic questions tend to be sorted out to the State Department and then often referred to desks depending upon where on the world the issue is taking place, while military questions will go to the Department of Defense, fiscal questions to Treasury, and so on. Because organizations and decision makers have finite time and resources, they can't possibly consider all available alternatives equally or completely. Instead, they tend to satisfice, seeing which option is most likely to work and then settling in on that option, essentially suffering from a form of tunnel vision where they may overlook or ignore new options or alternatives. Crisis thinking also encourages decision makers to focus on solutions that reduce uncertainty, particularly in the short term. And because of the time and resource intensity of developing new plans of action, the bureaucracy will tend to favor options which draw on pre-existing plans, utilizing existing repertoires and procedures when making new decisions. And so, while Operation Anadyr began under conditions favoring the utmost secrecy, once in Cuba, operations defaulted to standard operating procedures. Soviet engineers and military construction efforts were used to operating inside the Soviet Union, where there was really no need for secrecy or efforts to disguise the construction. Therefore, once operation began, it was assigned to units to carry out the task, and they did so according to their standard operating procedures. As a result, the U.S. was able to discover the Soviet missile sites. And once discovered, the debate over what option to follow within XCOM quickly boiled down to just a couple of options, blockades or airstrikes. Indeed, initially there was near universal support for the airstrike option. But there were challenges to this option. The Air Force couldn't guarantee that a strike would take out all of the Soviet missiles, and argued that a follow-on ground invasion might be necessary to secure the sites. Further, President Kennedy wanted to ensure that the airstrikes were surgical in nature, destroying the missiles without inflicting excessive damage and avoiding killing Soviet personnel to the extent that that was possible. The existing Air Force operational plans required an extensive bombing campaign that would have created much more collateral damage than Kennedy was comfortable with. And in the meantime, the Navy was already deployed in the area. It already had a plan in place for a blockade of Cuba, and because the White House could maintain direct communication with the various ships' captains, XCOM agreed to the blockade as the safest course of action. So why did the Soviets ultimately withdraw their missiles? Put simply, they didn't have a plan. The entire operation was dependent on maintaining secrecy until the missiles were deployed, after which time it wouldn't matter what the US did because they'd have the deterrence offered by the missiles in Cuba. But in the face of American early discovery of their operations and the US imposition of a blockade, the Soviet Union simply had no alternative and was forced to withdraw its missiles. The third explanatory model developed by Allison is the governmental politics model. This is sometimes called the palace politics model. From this perspective, policy decisions, even during a time of crisis, are best understood as the result of politicking, negotiation, and compromise between decision makers. While high-level decision makers may share a goal, for example, finding a way to force the Soviets to withdraw their missiles from Cuba, they may still differ in their opinions on how best to achieve that goal. Such differences may be the result of personal interests, backgrounds, experience, or other individual factors, but they may also be the result of positions within the bureaucracy and the effect that such positions might have in framing individual understandings of the crisis or the issue. Further, officials within policymaking circles may have different levels of input or power over the final decision. While in foreign policy the president is often viewed as having ultimate authority, even the president depends on gaining consensus among key advisors, whose ability to influence the president depends on a variety of factors, including individual charisma, personality, persuasive skills, personal ties to the president or other decision makers, and potentially a host of other factors. So how does Allison use this model to explain the crisis? We know that the Soviet premier Nikita Khrushchev was already under pressure from other high-ranking members of the Soviet leadership over concerns about the Soviet missile gap. In addition, the Soviet Union suffered in their efforts to force the United States to abandon West Berlin during the Berlin airlift crisis. Add that to the concerns over the state of the Soviet economy and the budget cuts imposed on the Soviet military as a result, and Khrushchev likely viewed placing the missiles in Cuba as a quick and easy way to overcome this criticism and to gain the support of key allies in Soviet leadership. At the same time, President Kennedy was under pressure from Republicans in Congress to step up pressure on the Soviet Union. Just a year earlier, the United States was humiliated by the failed Bay of Pigs invasion of Cuba, which Republicans had made a major campaign issue in the 1962 midterm elections. President Kennedy believed that appearing weak in the face of Soviet aggressive maneuvers in Cuba would create political risks for him and his party. Kennedy therefore settled on a stronger, more militarized response rather than a diplomatic one. This decision was largely supported by ExComm, which initially supported airstrikes against the missile sites in Cuba. But several of Kennedy's closest advisors, including his brother and the Attorney General Robert Kennedy, as well as Special Counsel Ted Sorensen, favored a blockade. Meanwhile, the military, particularly General Curtis LeMay, was pushing a more aggressive posture, wanting to make up for the failure of the Bay of Pigs and remove Castro once and for all. And on the other side, Adlai Stevenson, the U.S. ambassador to the United Nations, was urging caution and arguing that the U.S. should seek a diplomatic solution to the crisis. This combination of factors ultimately compelled Kennedy to settle on the blockade option, an option that was aggressive enough to placate Republicans in Congress and the more assertive actions supported by his military advisors, while simultaneously not abandoning the diplomatic options favored by Sorensen or moving down a path that would likely lead to nuclear war between the US and the Soviet Union. Once the blockade was imposed, Khrushchev sought to save face and demanded that the U.S. withdraw its missiles from Turkey. Secretly, the United States reached a deal with Khrushchev, negotiated in covert talks between Attorney General Robert Kennedy and the Soviet ambassador Anatoly Dobrynin, under which the United States would promise never to invade Cuba and would quietly remove its missiles from Turkey. The deal ultimately satisfied both parties. Kennedy appeared to stand strong in the face of Soviet aggression and compelled them to remove the missiles from Cuba, and Khrushchev could point to the American withdrawal of their missiles from Turkey and reduce pressure he felt from the other members of the Soviet Politburo. So which model best explains the Cuban Missile Crisis? That's a point for ongoing debate, and I'd be curious what you think. Let me know in the comments section below, and thanks for watching, everyone. Have a good day. Bye.